Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a week of kind of random subjects. And one of the things when we talk about World War II is it is full of crime. I mean, the greatest crime against humanity was essentially performed in World War II. But beyond that, within the military organizations, the US Army, British Army, so on and so forth, it's people, and people commit crimes. And within companies and platoons and what have you, there are kind of small charges that get dealt with, but there are greater actual proper crimes that would be considered crimes outside of the military, inside the military. So to tackle that subject and how they were treated within the US military, we have Mark M. Turner with us. So Mark is an assistant professor at the US Command and General Staff School, and he came on and did an earlier show about some of the women who participate in different countries in World War II, and this is another topic he's been working on. So without further ado, I will bring Mark in. So good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
Good afternoon. Doing quite well, and you?
Very well. So this is an interesting kind of subject of World War II, because, when you're talking about death, as we are on a massive, massive scale in World War II, looking at within those organizations, the fact that there are still crimes being committed, everything from some soldier in a barrack block nicking his mate's, ration box to capital crimes. And it's something that, does it affect the outcome of the war? Is it something we should be talking about? Well, this is what we're going to discuss tonight. How was it dealt with? What conclusions can we draw from it? Is it a subject we need to be looking at more? And so on and so forth. So you've come armed with a very, very intensive PowerPoint, armed with pie charts and graphs and data and columns and text like that. So essentially over to you, Mark. But you've got to get your disclaimer in at the beginning because you work for the military. So let me do that, and then let us know what your aims are with this show.
Okay. So
yeah, you are part of the U.S. Army, so blah 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 blah. These views are your views, and they do not represent the Army. So what are your aims for this show then, Mark? What are we trying to achieve today?
Yeah. So and I think we'll actually get to that on the next chart. If you want to, we can go right ahead if you'd like to go ahead and do that. And just alluding a little bit back to that preceding chart. Yes. So I do proudly work for the U.S. Army. I think some of you may have seen the previous show that we did on Allied Women of War II. Covered a few countries. Of course, there were technological issues, which has since been rectified, I think. So some of you may already be familiar with who I am. Also retired Army Lieutenant Colonel. Anyway, so now I get to teach up and coming senior captains and junior majors, and I absolutely love it. But of course, here with all of you, and it's a privilege to be here with you. But particularly talking about topics that are quite sensitive in nature. Although I think that the Army's, I think, getting a little bit better about talking about these kinds of things, in the classroom and elsewhere. But still, of course, as Paul has indicated, we got the standard disclaimer, right? So what I'll share, what I have to say, opinions and whatnot, and my responses to questions aren't going to represent the official position of the Army or the Department of Defense. And then, of course, there's the other bit of a warning, so to speak. Maybe that's too strong a term to use, but we're talking about some fairly sort of weighty topics here. Now, I have by design intentionally, tried to stay away from anything that is sort of like voyeuristic or ghoulish. Anything that just really would be inappropriate. But still, we're going to talk about capital offenses and some pretty heinous activity, not just U.S. but other participants in the war as well. So just again to let everybody know up front. So there may be some material that you might consider to be somewhat graphic or disturbing. I hope everybody does stick around for the entirety of the program. But if not, and if you do need to leave for whatever reason, please feel free to do so. Okay, yeah. So disclaimer and all that out of the way. I should probably also say, Paul, before getting into the key goals up front, so I'm just chock full of disclaimers and prefaces today. But just to get it out there, so and as you might have already surmised, I am not a legal scholar. I'm not a criminologist. I'm not a psychologist, a psychiatrist. I'm a lowly retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, and I get to teach, joint international interagency multinational operations strategy. You love it. So, and there may be some of you out there that do have these areas of expertise and education. So please feel free. If there's anything at all that I say that's incorrect, or that you want to add to, please. It's only going to make, I think, everybody's learning and gaining of knowledge that much better. Keeps me on my toes. And of course, I can go back and I can research other things that might come up through the course of the presentation today. So really excited to share this topic with you. And Paul, if you want to go, it's fine just to leave it here for a minute on the goals. So I am really excited to share this with you. And Paul had asked me this question at the very beginning of our last session, which again was Gremlins got a vote on that one. Anyway, so this appears to be running much better. But I suspect maybe a lot of us that are maybe of a certain age, and I don't mean for this to come across as sort of condescending or anything, but I think a lot of us, we kind of reach a point in our studies. Many of us have been looking at this particular conflict for most of our lives, and you're ready to explore other areas. And it's not to say that you don't continue to learn new things about Normandy or Iwo Jima or whatever it might be. But for me, I've really begun to move more and more sort of off these well-trodden paths, and this just really interested me. It's not that again I'm not looking to sort of throw harpoons at my own institution and my predecessors. This is sort of a platform to do that. I hope that this can be as constructive as possible. But I found it really interesting. These topics will come up sort of peripherally once in a while. For instance, for all of you, and many of you, I think, are much more knowledgeable about the state of affairs when it comes to cinema, or just with all of the reading that you've done in your studies. But even if you're only looking at film, so sometimes this will come up, the court-martial of Jackie Robinson, or we all remember, I guess maybe for those of us who are more of a certain age, but we remember the beginning of the Dirty Dozen, right? And of course, rattling off all the various offenses that these guys have committed. Of course, there's the kind of that rather, whether you like the movie or not, there's one, I guess actually there are multiple scenes, but one that really sticks out and is vivid from Fury, with Brad Pitt's character. And I think it's Logan Lerman, I think I got his name correct. Kind of this confidence building sort of, whatever exercise with the German POW. So anyway, so these things do pop up, once in a while. And I do have to say, thinking about this sort of in real time right now, I could see where, perhaps this is kind of an uncomfortable topic, because when you look at this in a much broader context, yes, I think we can all say, and we can agree, I hope, that regardless of which nation you come from, allied nation, partner nation, neutral country, whatever it was, that we all have individuals in our populations that do, bad things. But I could see where potentially, this could be taken in bad taste. Like, how dare you want to talk about, any massacre that may have been committed, by U.S. personnel, sort of again against the backdrop of the we'll never know the exact number, right? The millions that died in mainland China. Again, we'll never know the exact number, of Holocaust victims, the homosexuals, Roma, the disabled Jews. The list goes on and on. But I still think this is worth, talking about. And I'm really interested to see what the feedback will be and see if you, if you agree with me or not, on that. So yeah, as the slide indicates here, I think that, particularly, and I think it does become easier the further we get away maybe from the event. I know I had done some reading a while back that for the Civil War, American Civil War generation, that more of these sorts of topics, more sort of like unpleasant or sensitive topics, really began to come out. I mean, within historiography, within academia, and elsewhere, as we began to, really the American Civil War, sort of that generation that fought, began to sort of fade into memory. And so maybe we do have more of an opportunity now to explore this without, some of the baggage, I guess, that we're all carrying.
I would add, though, Mark, that we do have that extra level of burden when it comes to World War II, with that label of the greatest generation, that the generation, the militaries before and since haven't had that label. And we bandy around the world, they're all heroes. When we talk about all the people who came through Italy in World War II, or came through Normandy, or went through the Pacific Island, they're all heroes. We owe our freedom to all of them. They're the greatest generation. And of course, those are ideals. That it's lovely to have that thought in your head, but within, as the US 16 million in uniform, of course, there are more than a few bad apples within that bunch. And of course, it will raise the question of, with all the horrors going on around, does that create a greater environment for people who have criminal tendencies to feel legitimate about doing that in an area? That's the whole big debate in the Big Red One with Lee Marvin, isn't it? About we don't murder, we kill. Who's to decide what the rules are? Stalin, if you kill one person, it's a crime. If you kill a whole population, it's just a statistic, isn't it? So all of those kind of bigger themes come up within this. So I can feel it'll be almost a philosophical discussion as this, as well as a practical examination of the system in place to deal with it. But it'll probably raise more questions than it answers. But then that's good. That's discussion. But anyway, back to you, Mark, and we'll pile right in.
No, and you bring up some fascinating points here, and I'll talk a little bit. Again, I'm not a legal scholar, but I will talk a little bit about the rules of land warfare and the version that was sort of carried by the U.S. Army and Army Air Forces in the World War II, as I recall, was dated 1 October 1940. So we had that. We also had the Articles of War, which you can actually trace all the way back to the Continental Army, and if you want to trace it even further back, we can take it back to your country of origin. Yeah. A lot of that originates in England. So yeah, we'll bring some of that up, but it's. Yeah, I certainly don't want to. The intent here is not to sort of do this, like the armchair quarterback and tisk and sort of overly legalistic. Well, how dare they? This is what this is when we get into microscopic level detail where this specific article of war. This is what it says. I mean, as you say, I think that it needs to be taken into the environment they're operating in needs to be taken into consideration. I think that probably, in particularly when you're trying to expand the Army to the extent that we did expand the armed forces to during the Second World War, that you're going to maybe have to cut some corners, quite frankly. I mean, I think even in my own experience, and I don't want to sort of like try to curb fit that into War II, but I mean, I think it's related that, we were even willing, when we were, really wanting to bump up the end strength, particularly in the Army, sort of at the peak of the Iraq War. And I mean, there were people, I mean, not that I don't think that we were ever willing to sort of, bring in felons that I can recall, but I mean, we certainly were willing to sort of, accept perhaps, some lower educational expectations, that kind of thing, just to meet that end strength. And so it doesn't really surprise me necessarily that we would end up, bringing in some individuals that, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but maybe, didn't necessarily meet sort of pre-war, sort of like intellectual, cognitive standards. Maybe not have passed, classification tests before the war, but you're like, okay, we're now in a global conflict, and we need, single-digit, double-digit millions of men and women in uniform to win this war alongside our partners and our allies. So, yeah, I think it's almost inevitable it's going to happen. So then I think more about how do you deal with it, right? If we can anticipate, and particularly as we go back, because again, and Paul, you've talked about this greatest generation, Studs Terkel, the Good War, Tom Brokaw, greatest generation, all that. But we can go back to any conflict. I mean, I think about some of the the ones that come to mind in U.S. military history, and we're going to find examples of war crimes that were committed. The War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Civil War, Philippine-American War. I mean, we get the point there. So if we know that these kinds of things are going to occur, then maybe we can take this particular case study and try to lean forward and anticipate. What are some of the types of things that might happen? What can we do to try to preempt some of that? And if it's going to happen, then even given mitigation, then how do we go about holding people accountable, right? And hopefully trying to create some kind of deterrent effect over others who might be willing or might be considering conducting similar types of activities. So yeah, sorry, that was a lot to say in response to just some brief comments that you had provided there. But yeah, so I think we go back and we look at this really covered aspect of the war, that one of the big things again that I hope that we can do today is have a conversation that hopefully, doesn't sort of devolve into the whataboutism. Yes, and I think probably just about everybody, if not everybody here in the virtual space right now, if we look at what the Allies, I think, did relative to what what's happening in Nazi Germany or in Nazi occupied areas, Imperial Japan, maybe to a lesser extent, fascist Italy. You're trying to achieve some sort of like moral relativism or anything, or put them on the same, I think, moral plane would just be ridiculous. And so I'm not here to try to do any of that. And so hopefully, again, we can kind of avoid the, what about this? Well, yeah, that's bad, but what about this and that? And so anyway, hopefully we can avoid a little bit of that. And again, I've already spoken, I think, to some of this, but I think in terms of looking at this from a utilitarian perspective, it's not just to say, okay, well, these things happened 75, 80 years ago and interesting and good to know. But I think now, particularly with what, I do for a living, where we're pivoting, not entirely, but we're pivoting really, more towards what in joint doctrinal parlance we call large-scale combat operations, right? So maybe it's not something that quite equates to the Second World War, but then again, it's not in Iraq or in Afghanistan. It's not COIN, it's not counterterrorism. So if we have identified that our adversaries, principal adversaries, are Russia or China, and hypothetically, who knows, could find ourselves in Taiwan or in the Donbass or somewhere else in Ukraine, I think it's important, to look at these types of issues and situations. Because one thing I'll show, and I think, Paul, you've already seen all the charts, but later on, I've got a couple of public opinion polls, wartime public opinion polls. And I think, at least, and this is just kind of like my back of the envelope impression, that I think as these huge conflicts unfold and sort of drag on, I think over time, that perhaps, we might be more willing to accept maybe some behaviors that perhaps, in the early days we might have considered, repugnant, or, oh, we would never do that. We'd never consider unleashing this particular weapon or capability or whatever. But I think, and I'm open to your thoughts, Paul, on this, Paul, or anybody else. But I think, over time, again, we start maybe considering doing some things maybe earlier on, because we just want it to end. It's been dragging on 4 or 5 years. We've lost hundreds of thousands of people, along with, all the civilians and whatnot. And so let's just make it end. And so, so if that requires, for instance, the atomic bomb, and I think we'll maybe get to a little bit of that toward the very end, that may be called for. And I should say also that again, given that certainly is a slippery slope, and I think a lot of it's sort of predicated upon opinions. I have intentionally, maybe I'll sort of upset some real air power enthusiasts by doing this, but I am really intentionally, by and large, staying away from those strategic bombing sort of, discussions about, in fact, I just saw one on social media a few days ago about, like, again, we're going to debate again, the decision to drop the atomic bomb. And of course, there was like the ongoing discussions about the firebombing of, mainland Japan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm sort of staying away from that. And I think hopefully, clearer cut, examples where, like a lot of this probably isn't necessarily completely black and white. Lots of it is, shades of gray. But I think, it's maybe easier to talk about some of these matters that maybe might be a little bit, less debatable than, again, just the never-ending discussions about, again, strategic bombing and who was worse and who killed more civilians and who targeted which city and this kind of thing. I mean, not to say that that's not all important, but I've excluded that from the presentation today. So, and the other thing I hope that I can contribute to, Paul, with this, to maybe serve as a little bit of a catalyst, if possible, is that, and I'm not really that attuned to or aware perhaps as to what's happening within other sort of academic circles out there, but and it's probably already happening. But it would really be fascinating to see what's occurring, say, in the UK or in Canada, Australia. Is there a point at which, whether it's within academia or practitioners, or even, well, this may be a fraught discussion to have sort of at a national level, talking about these kinds of things. But is there a point where perhaps, sort of a deeper, fuller investigation, honest investigation can take place, and what can we learn from it? I do know that there are some examples. I was looking a little bit, for example, at British court martials and desertion rates and whatnot. And so I know that every country is different. So I think, as I understand, a lot of the British Second World War personnel records are not yet available. I mean, so you can get records.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe there'll come a time where more of that's going to be accessible. But I hope that, again, at some point, maybe that'll be a consideration, kind of across the board, that we try to go back and look at this, and again, not to sort of like cast stones, but what can we learn from it, really, going forward? What do we need to know as militaries and societies going forward? So on this chart, Paul. So I think where I'll probably spend the majority of the time today, we'll be talking about examples of murder and manslaughter. Yes, I know, very pleasant topics, but anyway, we're talking about U.S. military crimes. So there you go, capital cases or capital offenses. And I'll touch a little bit upon some of the other ones, but just given the time that I think is available, and of course, Paul, you're the arbiter, the decision maker here, but perhaps I can come back at some point and maybe address some of these other matters. Again, it wouldn't be anything gratuitous or inappropriate, but maybe come back and talk a little bit more about the drug use, looting, desertion, and cowardice. I think is pretty interesting. So that'll be obviously your decision, Paul. But
all potentially subjects in their own right, I mean, and looting is how they handled that. I mean, in Normandy, for example, that became a thing that they had to disguise. And I think the British Army came up with a thing that if you take something from a French farm and use it on site, so if you take milk from a cow, that's fine, that's not looting. But if you take it in a bucket away from the farm and take it somewhere else, that can count as looting. And this is based on experiences in Sicily or Italy or something. So they're actually investing time in some quite seemingly mundane things when you're actually trying to win a war against an entrenched German army. But these were things that came up. So yeah, looting, drug use has been discussed. That was a big topic recently, with the German military using drugs in combat. So drug use, what becomes, we know that U.S. airborne troops were given things to keep them awake in an aircraft. Is that drug use? But then is recreational drug use? What have there's lots of myriad of rabbit holes to go down with these subjects. But yeah, the big one is going to be murder and manslaughter. So let's dive in, Mark. Let's move in.
All right. Well, I will certainly take the cue there. And just for the audience, just so that you're all aware, that basically the front half of the presentation is much more quantitative in nature, and so I can't wait to see what everybody thinks about this. Really excited to see what the feedback is. But just going back in there and just looking at the available statistics, like what do they tell us? And so we'll look at that, and then really the second half is more focused on some actual examples to really try to humanize the topic, maybe make it a little bit more memorable. It's not this abstract, number like, okay, X number of, whatever people were executed, but then actually try to more personalize it, humanize it. So that's really the objective there with that. Okay, so we move now to the overview. Okay, and so again, this really will be the front half of the presentation. So we begin, and when I say overview, we're really looking at the entirety of the U.S. Armed Forces, and yet another of my endless caveats here. So and perhaps my search has not been as fruitful as it needed to be, or I didn't overturn some stones perhaps that I should have. But I have found with this topic that it is very, very difficult to try to go and do sort of this across the board, holistic appreciation of how U.S. not just military crime, but then military justice was handled. So it's been sort of like this jigsaw puzzle, trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So bear with me. Again, I'm going to try to give you as much of an overview as I can here early on. But you will find that this will be, I think, more slightly oriented, or will lean more towards the Army and the Army Air Forces, and just sort of by virtue of what's available, European theater of operations. I've tried to cover other theaters where I can, other services, but some of them are making it more difficult, it seems, to get access to some of these records. So anyway, yeah. So let's look at this first overview chart here. Kind of interesting. This is what's so fascinating about this. I really didn't know what I was going to encounter when I got into this topic, and some of these numbers have really just kind of maybe thrown me for a loop a little bit when I saw some of these numbers. So, for example, we look at the document there on the left, and what I've done with most of these charts is I pull out some of the key text and then kind of blow that up so you can kind of get a sense for what the document actually says. And I should also say that what I've tried to do here with these is to use primary sources wherever I can. In some instances, this just weren't available, so I had to go to secondaries. So in this instance here, yeah, pretty interesting. So didn't know this before I started looking into this particular topic, but there are roughly 1.7 million, with a big M, right? You didn't mishear me on that. 1.7 million courts-martialed that are going to be carried out during the course of the during World War II, pardon me. Now, of course, need to clarify there. Those are actual trials. Okay, those aren't actual convictions. Those are trials. So it's not that we look at the numbers that Paul was throwing out earlier. 12 million in uniform, 16 million. It's not that we look at the force and say, oh well, like one out of every 12 or 1 out of every 16 was being court-martialed. What we find actually is in many instances we've got some repeat offenders, and I'll talk about one later today. Private Clarence Bertucci, the culprit of the Midnight Massacre in Utah, pardon me, where he actually had multiple courts-martial under his belt before he kind of committed the big one, and which we'll hear more about later on. Okay, so yeah, 1.7 million courts-martialed, the trials. Also, as we come out of the war, we're going to have over 100 capital executions. More on that particular topic later. And at the end of the war, we will still have some 45,000 U.S. servicemen. And you notice I'm a little bit hesitant there by not saying women, but by and large, I will say it's servicemen that are going to be in some form of confinement. So getting back to the conviction rate, I unfortunately do not have the actual conviction numbers for the naval services, so Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Navy, but I do for the Army and for the Army Air Forces. And so those numbers are roughly 90,000. So about 90,000 wartime convictions in the Army and the Army Air Forces. And so if you figure that, again, the naval services are roughly half the size of the Army and the Army Air Forces combined, I know, yeah, that's not very precise, math, but I think that we can conclude safely that we will see that conviction number sort of cross that's the 100,000 boundary. So I think it's probably safe to say we're going to see over 100,000 convictions if you want to look across the entirety of the services during the war. And also when I speak to this, again, just to put it in perspective, again, 1.7 million, huge number. I've talked about the repeat offenders, but also remember just the size of the military. So if we go to the last year of the war, you're looking at my numbers here, over 8.2 million in the Army, over 3.3 million in the Navy, Marine Corps, 474,000, right? So my grand total that I've gotten courtesy of the National War II Museum is 12.2 million. Okay, so we're not talking about, again, like 10% of the force, 20% of the force running around, doing nefarious things and getting in trouble and getting court-martialed. It's actually a relatively small number. It's somewhere, I would say, in the low single percentage range, which I think is certainly a good thing. Okay, so those are really the highlights on the first chart there, Paul. And what I wanted to do next was talk a little bit, since I've talked about the courts-martial and you've gotten a sense for how many were conducted. So this, again, was really interesting, and what I didn't want to do is kind of go back and, again, sort of shoehorn my own experience with what we now call the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice. It did not exist in World War II. They didn't call it that. But to go back and look at how across the services they would actually exercise military jurisdiction, primarily through trials. And I'll try not to get really into the weeds on this. I've got the weeds available, but I think we'll try to keep this maybe at the naval brothers and sisters will appreciate more at the wave top level. So just to state briefly here, the Army and the Air Force, Army and the Army Air Forces are going to rely upon essentially 3 different types of trials to exercise military jurisdiction. And you really work from the topmost there, and that really would be for the most serious offenses, will end up resulting in typically the longest sentences. Of course, typically, general courts martial, you're talking about what would be considered a felony level offense. If we were talking about civil offenses, that's where you're going to find those capital cases where it may result, if there's a conviction, may result in life imprisonment, may result in the death penalty. So general courts martial. And actually, those, as you hopefully you can discern here from the chart and what I put in parentheses, that actually will all of the services, right, will use general courts martial. Okay, moving down next, kind of moving down to the next, sort of rung here, and with each of these types of trials, they each carry, sort of different guidelines, responsibilities, roles. So, for instance, as you drop down, say, from a general courts martial to say maybe a summary courts martial, which are common to those who are common to all the services. Yeah. So, who can actually convene the court martial? How many officers are required, to actually take part in the trial? Do you have to have a judge advocate? Do you have to have legal representation, defense, a prosecution, present, pardon me. The maximum punishments obviously change quite a bit as you move, say, again, from general down to special down to summary. So you kind of get the sense here. And then the same thing also for the reviewing authority. So typically, and it really is particularly important when you're talking about the GCMs, the general courts martial, where you're talking long prison sentences, you're talking life imprisonment, death penalty, who actually will go back and has the authority to review those cases and perhaps recommend maybe a commutation, a clemency, maybe a reduced sentence. That also is going to change, contingent upon which type of courts martial is being conducted. So again, general courts martial is going to relate to all of the services. Moving down to the next level, a special courts martial is unique, and I say primarily, I'm kind of hedging my bets a little bit, but 99.9% of the time, it's going to be the Army and the Army Air Forces that are going to be conducting a special courts martial. We then move down to the next level, summary courts martial. Again, that's going to be common to all of the services. So Navy can do that, Army, Air Forces, Army, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get the last two, which are unique to only the naval services. And so one is called deck court. And one thing, again, that I learned going through all this research is that, yes, it principally pertains to sort of, exercising jurisdiction, over Marine Corps, Navy, Coast Guard personnel, but also, I think maybe as you pick up here, it also includes sort of these, kind of they're little bit anomalous. So Coast and Geodetic Survey, okay. Well, yes, in wartime, they also can wear uniforms and can fall underneath the command, of one of the naval services. So they also, their personnel would be subject to courts martial and to military justice. Same thing with the public health service, the commissioned officers within the public health service. So you've got deck court again for the naval services, and then at the very, very bottom would be what's called captain's mast. And so again, limited number of officers. You don't have to have actual counsel present for that. Sort of, the sentences are relatively, minor in nature. One thing I thought was interesting too, before we proceed and don't turn this into like, a law school 101 class, which of course I couldn't pull off anyway on my best day. But as I recall, and I'm kind of looking here at some of my notes, as I recall, when it comes to to general courts martial for the naval services, it's kind of interesting that there's a clear delineation when I was going back and looking at the wartime. Yeah, here it is. Looking at the wartime documents. So when you look at general courts martial punishments under the naval services, it's funny that it specifically states that let's see, punishments can include death, dishonorable discharge, confinement at hard labor. Other punishment is the court may direct. But here's an interesting point, caveat here. It does say punishments that are forbidden: flogging, branding, marking, or tattooing of the body, which is kind of, you know, one of those throwbacks, right, to the kind of the Continental Navy or the U.S. Navy of the 18th or 19th century. So by the time we get to War II, again, you know, like the cat of nine tails and that kind of thing has been forbidden as an option to commanders for various again sentences, you know, given a court-martial conviction. So, and one last thing I would say here too is that at least when it comes to the manual for courts-martial, so that's the basically the document that the Army and the Army Air Forces use to provide basically the details on how to carry out courts-martial. Again, who's required, you know, what articles of war should be considered. It also, interestingly, includes maximum punishments for each of these various offenses. So you can go in there and you'll see, you know, maximum punishment for, you know, assault of an officer, multiple, you know, max punishment for, you know, falling asleep on guard duty as some examples. Pretty interesting. So yeah, but yeah, flogging is definitely out. Flogging is out in War II, at least when it comes to the U.S. Naval Services. Okay, so that was about it on that particular chart. And then moving on here, so we get back to our numbers, and you may recall in that very first overview chart that we talked about how at the very end of the war, we have roughly 45,000 U.S. uniformed personnel that are in confinement. So what I did here, and maybe you find this somewhat interesting, is to actually see how that population changes over time. And I think as you look at this, it's kind of a blinding flash of the obvious, right? I mean, as the size of your military grows and you've got more and more personnel that are, you know, say in active combat areas, it's no real surprise that the numbers are going to escalate over time. So again, you can see that here. And when we, I know that the primary source there is probably pretty hard to read, but when we talk about Army prisoners, so what we're talking about there are prisoners that are going to be, they are going through the process of being, maybe inducted is not the right word, but they're being received into federal institutions, you know, like federal prisons, what we call disciplinary barracks. We'll talk more about that more here in just a second. And it also includes what they call rehabilitation centers, and more on that also here in just a second. So the numbers are a little bit misleading. So we're not really getting the numbers for, say, you know, Army personnel who may be in a disciplinary training center, but we are getting the vast majority of those that are going to be in confinement in any particular year. And so went back and looked at this, some more research here, and did discover that during the war, the focus really is more on restoring those who have, I mean, unless it's kind of like the worst of the worst, like, you know, death penalty convictions and that kind of thing. But if it's a lighter sentence, really the services are much more interested in restoring these prisoners to duty, because again, we need as many. Again, we don't want convicted murderers like back in the ranks. And although again, I will give you some examples where that actually does happen, kind of, which is a bit of a shock. But anyway, the focus really is on restoring these individuals to duty, much less than it is keeping somebody locked up for 5, 10, 15, 20 years or paroling them. So some numbers here again, these come from the Secretary of War. And so he states, this is shortly after the war ends, that by November of 45, that the Army and the Army Air Forces have restored 17,000 men within the U.S. to active service. And also there's another 4,000 that get restored to duty overseas. Again, whether they're in a disciplinary training center, they're in a stockade or a guardhouse somewhere. But so pretty significant numbers, you know, 21,000 altogether. Another 6,000 receive discharges or releases of a different type. And also he states that, and this is where maybe these numbers are a little bit misleading, in that the Secretary of War states that upon the conclusion of the war, that the Army and the Army Air Forces have actually handled a number, roughly 60,000. So there'll be about 60,000 prisoners who will be handled within the Army prison system before the war has concluded. I have already talked a little bit about again the emphasis really during the war on restoration to duty versus parole. What I don't really get into here, and this information is easy to find if you wanted to go back and look at it, but also, as you know, the president, you know, has sort of like the ultimate authority when it comes to clemency, you know, pardons, commutations, respites, remissions. So you can actually go and you can see by year, like, so how many did Harry S. Truman do? How many did FDR do during the course of the war? Numbers are actually fairly small. As I recall, they're in the hundreds, but that might be worth looking at. But again, so what the services really want to do is restore these individuals to duty. But then they flip the script. Once the war is over with, then they establish what initially is a board on clemency. They identify 28,717 military offenders that they want to take through this review process to ultimately parole them, because now we don't need as many sort of troops under arms as we did during the war. So again, they'll switch to, again, wanting to parole a lot more than restore to duty. Okay, so that's it on the highlights there. Okay, so yeah, we talked again about these individuals who are actually in confinement. So what kinds of locations, what kinds of facilities are we talking about here? This again was really intriguing to go back and look into this. I knew a little bit about this, but pretty fascinating. I mean, again, and I'm sorry I'm geeking out on this topic. May not be everybody's cup of tea, but really interesting when you get down to the brass tacks here. Okay, so again, we're working from top to bottom in terms of the sort of the level of security, the types of places that individuals are going to go from the more serious offenses for, again, these longer sentences. So we're really starting there at the top with the federal civil institutions. Okay, so there will be cases where military prisoners are going to go to federal penitentiaries. They may go to reformatories, that where it's being run by civilians, the civilian correctional staff versus military. And so again, you're oftentimes going to see really some of the worst, the murderers, the rapists, people like that are going to end up in federal civil institutions. Again, forgive me, like I've got much more robust and richer data available when it comes to the Army and the Army Air Forces. But I can tell you at the conclusion of the war that there will be 2,700 soldiers and airmen that are going to be confined in federal institutions, that top category there. Okay, when we move down to this next category, the military prisons, and we kind of bifurcate this a little bit. So for the Army and the Army Air Forces, we call them, disciplinary barracks. And there was no way that I could, list every single one. There were quite a few, but I've given you a couple just to kind of whet your appetite as to where some of these USDBs, U.S. disciplinary barracks were located. Of course, Fort Leavenworth, like we were all, I think, familiar with that one, still around and still housing some pretty bad folks. Some of these, of course, since then, like in Governor's Island, perhaps have been shut down. And really, the intent behind these disciplinary barracks is they're going to house prisoners who have been convicted of a military offense, where they've already received a dishonorable discharge, and now they're general prisoners. They may be suffering some sort of a mental or neurological disorder, but they haven't been declared insane, as an example. And even here in the disciplinary barracks, there is still some effort made to, wherever possible, to restore as many of these convicts as possible to the active ranks. Again, if that can be done. Again, going back to the Army and the Army Air Forces numbers, so in August of '45, there will be 13,500 soldiers and airmen in disciplinary barracks. And then in addition to that, when we look at the naval services, I've given you a few examples there. Portsmouth Naval Prison up in Maine really is the one that you may be most familiar with. In fact, very late in the war, there are a number of U-boat crews that are interrogated at Portsmouth Naval Prison. In fact, and I won't try to play fast and loose with the specifics. There are probably people out there that know a lot about the U-boat fleet, but there actually is a U-boat commander that after he undergoes interrogation, and I'm not trying to say that there's a matter of correlation or causation here, but he actually commits suicide I think it's in Boston, a few weeks after his time there under interrogation at the Portsmouth Naval Prison. So anyway, I do have some numbers for Portsmouth Naval Prison. So again, those are going to be convicts from the Marine Corps, from the Navy, and from the Coast Guard primarily. So the number that I've got for that one is that Portsmouth Naval Prison will house 3,088 inmates, and that's going to be an N45. That was really max occupancy for the prison there. And the last thing I'd say here about the military prisons, So back to the Army and back to the disciplinary barracks. In April of 46, the Army will still be responsible for running, all that, what they call 3 maximum security disciplinary barracks. One of those actually is Fort Leavenworth. I guess it relates in a surprise. And they will still be running 10 medium security disciplinary barracks at that point. Okay, moving on down from there. So everything I've talked about to this point on this chart really is within what at the time would have been called the ZI, or the zone of the interior, right? It's the lower 48, right? It's the contiguous United States. Now we're going to look a little bit here on this next category at the I guess you'd say maybe the pinnacle of confinement facilities actually within theater. Okay, and so these are called disciplinary training centers. And so they are intended to rehabilitate military offenders that are considered restorable to duty, also to detain others until they can be transferred back to the States. That would be another example. And I also run across in my readings that, again, these would tend to be shorter sentences. So typically like 6 months or less, you'd house them in a DTC or a disciplinary training center. However, there are some big caveats to that. And so I will give you an example here later on. When I say the name Horace T. West, that probably may already be ringing some bells with some folks when it comes to the Biscari massacre. So he actually is an example of someone who was housed at a DTC, above and beyond a 6-month sentence. So you can see where all of these DTCs are going to be established. The ones you see for French Algeria and French Morocco, eventually those will be collapsed into one central facility in Italy. As I recall, it's at Pisa, where that one will be established. There's one at Brussels. Of course, you've all heard of Shepton Mallet, England. There are a couple in France. There'll be one established in Würzburg, Germany, after the war's over, basically to move a lot of those inmates that are still in theater from France and Belgium, into Germany. There's one in near Manila, and there's also one at Schofield Barracks, which is on the island of Oahu, which of course at the time is still the territory of Hawaii. So some numbers there on the DTCs. So let's see. August 45, there are 10,500 soldiers and airmen that are still being confined in one of these DTCs. It saw the opportunity for restoration to duty. Ultimately, as you fast forward, once the war concludes, about 5,000 of those general prisoners that still in DTCs are going to be shipped back to the States. That's going to happen in December, January, and February of 46. So as you might imagine, as you're doing the math kind of in your heads there, subtract, the 10.5K from the 4.8K, and the ones that are remaining are those ones that they think can restore back to duty, and really the remaining 5,000 roughly are those that are going to have to go into longer term confinement. Probably again in a disciplinary barracks or maybe even a federal prison back in the States. Okay, rehabilitation centers. So these are actually established only in the States. There's one for each of the 9 service commands within the States. And they are, as the name, I think, clearly implies there. I mean, it's an oxymoron, clearly implying. But they're all about education, about training, again, getting people back into the ranks. Again, typically, but it's a long-term process. Usually it takes more than 6 months for that actually to be accomplished. And even if you go into a rehabilitation center, again, you kind of move up to the next level if it's found that you are not considered restorable to duty. So, okay, you didn't, you kind of haven't, the training and the education hasn't paid off. And so we don't consider you, we've declared you unrestorable. So we're going to have to move you to, say, for instance, one of the disciplinary barracks. So again, you already heard the numbers, how many will be established in the U.S. In August of 45, there will be 6,000 soldiers and airmen in rehabilitation centers. And also, the Navy will establish a similar area-like capability. They're called Naval Retraining Commands. One is established East Coast, Norfolk, Virginia. One established West Coast at Mare Island, California. Okay, another one that and this actually didn't sort of make the slide here. It's already busy enough. One more type of facility is the processing center. There were 2. Again, East Coast is one East Coast processing center in business, so to speak, from 43 to 45 at Camp Edwards, Massachusetts. And then the other West Coast processing center again, 43, 45, and operating at Camp McQuaid in California. So what these, and the name is kind of, it's a little bit misleading or euphemistic. Processing center, what is that? Well, these are for soldiers who, you may have heard the term before, go over the hill. So these are soldiers that are either in replacement depots in the U.S. or their units are about to embark for overseas, and they go over the hill, right? They go AWOL. And so, presuming that these individuals can be apprehended, they typically are going to be sent to one of these processing centers, and then from there, sent on their merry way, overseas. And I couldn't get exact numbers on this, but I have been able to conclude it somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of soldiers and airmen who are going to go through one of these two processing centers before the war concludes. And then down to our last two types of facilities here. First would be the stockade or the guardhouse. Many of you probably have heard those terms before. And as I was going back and doing the research, I kind of find those terms are used somewhat interchangeably. Sometimes they'll say guardhouse, sometimes they'll say stockade. So here in the ZI or zone of interior, you'll have a stockade or a guardhouse typically, for each post, whether it's Army or Army Air Forces. So you'll have one there. And then also, as you look at units, sort of like the deployable units that are serving overseas, or maybe even in the States, they also will have a stockade or a guardhouse. And those typically run from the lowest level that I found those operating would be at the regimental level. And they seem to, from what I've been able to conclude, all the way to the field army level. So for example, 3rd Army is going to have a stockade. Yeah. 8th Army is going to have a stockade. And of course we could go on, ad nauseum with all the field armies, but all the way from, again, field army, down to guardhouse. And then really is, again, anything kind of above and beyond that field army, guardhouse, those individuals more than likely are going to one of those disciplinary training centers.
Now, just a question for you, Mark, before we move on, because while we've got the word rehabilitation on the screen there, a thing that has come up to my head is that the U.S. military is, I wouldn't even want to guess how many countries the U.S. military end up being in World War II, but it's going to be a lot. And we're going to be in countries where we are there as allies. We're going to be in countries we are there as aggressors, so on and so forth. But we're talking about countries that have their own criminal systems, their own court systems, their own punishments. Now, I know there's sort of the two types of crime. There's crimes committed by U.S. military on base against fellow soldiers. AWOL is a military crime. You're damaging your unit. But then we cross the line to the theft from civilians, the rape of civilians, the murder of civilians, all those things there. With all the countries the U.S. military were in World War II, there are countries that would have had some very, very tough versions of crimes, and the word rehabilitation wouldn't come into things. There are countries the US were where people cut hands off for theft, things like that. So if someone has been apprehended, a US soldier has been apprehended by a law force within a country, and they've caught him for a crime, the US military would then claim that soldier and try him under their system. But at some point, did that ever cause problems? Because I know there's greater problems going in war, in that cities are under thousands of bombs and there's civilians being killed, and I guess the odd prisoner here and there isn't a priority for some of these countries the US military in. But I can see this is going to have an effect on the relations. I know we're going to talk about a particular criminal in Australia at some point, but did the US ever have problems getting their people back and saying, look, we're going to perform our own, we're trying him under our system, and getting pushback, but we don't like your system, we'd like to try him under our system?
I haven't run across any cases like that, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that those are out there. So and I like this. I was actually jotting this down as we were talking, a bit of a homework project to see if I can go back and find some examples. But I do know, and this is kind of an incomplete response to your question, but I do know when it comes to, and I was going to touch upon this later on anyway, but when it comes to actually carrying out, executions, at least when it comes to the ETO, there are examples where again, we're talking really Army here primarily, and to a lesser extent Army Air Forces. Well, they will actually carry out that execution. Typically, it's a hanging, for the most part. They will actually do it in somewhere in the vicinity of the location where the crime was executed. So perhaps that might, ameliorate some of that if you're going to a particular French town, city, whatever, and it's literally a public hanging of a particular, offender. But with that said, those aren't really as common, really, as the executions that are really going to be covered are carried out sort of behind, the barbed wire, behind prison walls at places like, Shepton Mallet, or whatever, the disciplinary training center at Pisa, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to go back and dig into that more. But
I mean, we live in a world now, whereas if I was arrested transferring drugs from some country in the Far East, somewhere, I would be tried under the laws of that country. My own government might try and intercede on my behalf. They might try and ask for leniency, or they might try and send some legal team out there. But basically, I'd be tried by the country in which I committed the crime. But with the military, that is not the case. Basically, in basic principle, that would apply to the British Army and all the other armies we're talking about as well. It's military supersedes the laws of any country you happen to be in, whether you're there with the agreement of the country or whether you're there to take out that country. The rules that the military has priority in this regard. Yep, and that's always been the case, I think, isn't it? I can.
My response is a bit of a hesitant yes.
But yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't. We're going down a potential rabbit hole. There's lots more to go, and we're already an hour in, and we're not even scratched the surface yet.
Oh gosh,
it's just fascinating that the military is the system that trumps everything else, no matter where you are and what the circumstances are. I know it's interesting. We'll move on, but I'll put up your next slide. So I think we should move on. Otherwise, we're going to be here forever and ever.
Absolutely. Yeah. And all I would say about that, you pretty much, I think, have already have addressed this, but today we call them SOFAs, status of forces agreements. And so those are all prearranged with any country that our military is going to be operating in. So yeah, I mean, I suspect they weren't called SOFAs in 41 to 45, but I would imagine, for instance, if you're talking about, like France, so there would be some sort of pre-existing agreement. And I know I've seen some of your shows previously. Okay, so is that an agreement with de Gaulle? Is that an agreement with Darlan? Like, who are we agreeing with? But there'd be an agreement that hey, like, yes, you're coming in to help liberate our country, and so yes, we will hand these offenders over to you. We trust that you're going to sort of mete out justice at a level acceptable to the populace, in our country. But yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to go back and look and see if there actually are any cases.
And I'll just put up what Sheldrake said there about the UK, the United States of America Visiting Forces Act 19 gave specific immunity from UK prosecution to US forces in the UK. So there we are. So the British government actually addressed that, nipping it in the bud. Yes, that's good. That's interesting to know. Well, thanks, Sheldrake, for that.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, and thank you for getting me off that last slide. I think we were pretty much done. The only thing that, and I think everybody saw the last line there about brigs. So as you know, that's a naval service, unique entity that's like, a guardhouse or a stockade. So and I'll use some naval terminology. So brigs aboard, Navy or Marine Corps bases. So you're going to find them there ashore. And also, this is kind of, I think, a bit incomplete, but I do know that you would find brigs on capital ships. So there'd be a brig on cruisers, battleships, CVL, CVE, CVs, basically the three sort of basic, categories of aircraft carriers. So those capital ships would have brigs, and typically the Marine detachments, which are assigned to each of those three types of capital ship, will have there are other responsibilities as well, but part of their responsibility will to assist with guarding, prisoners in those brigs if they're being occupied afloat, right? As you're sort of maneuvering around a theater of operations. So, yeah, the next chart here moving on, Paul. So, hang on just a second here. A bit of a technological faux pas. My apologies. Okay, so yeah, on the next chart here, I included this. Again, unfortunately, dealing with some incomplete, information, but I wanted to at least give us some kind of sense for what the dichotomy might be between male and female sort of criminals and convicts. So really sort of, superficial, forgive me, information when it comes to folks that are in uniform. What I was able to pull here, and you can see I've got, general court-martial cases for male and female officers in the ETO. What I think actually might be more meaningful, because again, I don't think what that takes into account really is the actual size of the overall population. So you really can't look at that and say, oh, look at the number, how small it is. You have to kind of factor in what is the size of the population overall. But I think when we look at the civilian numbers, maybe that might be a little bit more instructive and kind of interesting. I mean, again, I don't think it's necessarily a real shock, perhaps, but we can see that in 44 and 45, the vast majority of inmates in civilian prisons in the U.S. will be male, basically, well, I guess 94, 95%, and then the remainder, 5-6% will be women. And I also wanted to share too, individuals, inmates who have received a death sentence, we see basically the same thing. So if we were to go through like each year, and we actually see it drop. In 41, the overall number of those who've received the death sentence is 132. It's actually going to decrease, kind of surprisingly, as the war progresses. So once we get to 45, there are only 75 persons that year receiving a death sentence. And maybe it isn't a surprise, but the female numbers are negligible. So literally from 41 to 45, there are 7 women who are going to sort of enter into the federal U.S. prison system, with a sentence of death. Okay, so that was it on Paul, on the male female. And now we turn to executions. We got a little bit of a taste of that before with how, by the end of the war, there are over 100, capital cases, over 100 executions by the time that the war concludes. So we got a little more information here to work with. So I will exclude talking about War I and doing a comparison of numbers, and I think just kind of get to the chase here. So between, or to the punchline. So between 42 and 45, there will be 141 executions, and all of those are going to be either Army or Army Air Forces personnel. And out of the 141, 70 are executed in the ETO, 27 in North Africa or the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, 24 in the Asiatic Pacific Theater of Operations, 19 in the US, and then 1 in the India Burma Theater. And with the exception of Eddie Slavic, who maybe we can talk about next time, because he's the one individual who was shot for desertion, first time that it had happened since the American Civil War. But every other individual who was executed, so the remaining 140 are all being executed for either rape and or murder. So that's how the numbers break out. And what's also interesting here too, and I really haven't gotten an answer yet. I probably need to go find a Navy lawyer to try to help me sort this one out. But what's really interesting too is that the Navy, to this day, has not executed any of their personnel since 1849. Why? I don't really understand. I mean, were there no mutinies after that point, and no one, committing capital offenses? But no, they haven't executed anybody since 1849. And the armed services overall. So now I'm talking about Army, Navy, Air Force, all of us sort of collectively. There have been no executions of military personnel since 1961, which is also kind of interesting. Okay, so moving on from there, and again, maybe later on at some other point we can talk more about the drug use. I just threw a little bit of a teaser in there about a study of 310 enlisted men addicted to the use of marijuana. So maybe that's best sort of saved for a different day. I think also the bottom point here is kind of interesting because we typically associate draft dodging or evasion or whatever. Like Vietnam is kind of like the default. Oh yes, tens of thousands of draft dodgers or evaders. Well, there's a fairly sizable number, but not just in War II, but you could even take it further back in history. So for War II, you can see the numbers here. There will be 16,000 individuals prosecuted for selective service violations, and then out of the 16,000, 6,000 of those were conscientious objectors who refused to cooperate with the selective service. And then from that number of 6,000, 4,000 are actually, and this is kind of surprising, Jehovah's Witnesses. So 4,000 of them are Jehovah's Witnesses, and they all go to jail. And then, of course, ultimately, once the war is concluded, Truman actually issues a series of presidential proclamations that ultimately, kind of get this number down to zero. It takes a while once the war is concluded, but eventually, all the selective service violators, will be released. Okay, so that was it for that chart, Paul. And moving on from there. Okay, and yeah, we'll really just hit the highlights on these here. Just again, wanted to give the audience, all the guests here, a bit of a sense as to what the numbers look like, at least in the concluding year of the war. So, what kinds of offenses are being are resulting in convictions, and how many of those convicted are actually being, again, in processed or inducted into, whether it's a federal prison, disciplinary barracks, rehabilitation center. So what I have here on the following slides, the first couple are all Army and Army Air Forces, and then we've got a little bit for the naval services as well. So again, I'm not going to go over this ad nauseum, but you can look at the numbers there on the screen. Hopefully, it's pretty easy to read. These all would be considered civil offenses. Okay, so again, these folks are going to go probably to a DB, or they're going to go to a federal penitentiary. A couple of highlights. So you can see we've got about a little bit less than 100 who are convicted and are going to the system for either murder or manslaughter. Also, some I guess maybe about 300 for some form of assault, and then also 33 for sodomy. And so maybe next time or at some other point can kind of talk about that issue again in a diplomatic, sort of tactful way. Yeah. But like how the military handled those sorts of issues during the war. Okay, so the next chart, moving on. Again, we're just continuing with the overview for Army prisoner reception for 1945. So the next chart, and again, we're just basically working sort of down the list here in terms of the severity of the offense. Yep, so the next one is, what really jumps out there, I think, at everybody would be larceny. So a little bit more than 1,000 who are convicted for some form of larceny. And the other one that caught my attention would be for all the various fraudsters. So if we add frauds against the government, forgery, uttering forged instruments, I guess it's somewhere around 500. I shouldn't be doing math in public, but something like that, right? That are going to be convicted and, again, go into the Army prison system in 45. Okay, next slide. Let's see. And this should, I think, be, this should be the last one. Yep, for civil offenses. Yep, there we go. And so we have quite a few there again for assault, about 200 or so. Drunken disorderly, I don't think that comes across maybe as any real surprise. Pretty low numbers though for drugs and liqueurs. So I may have expected the number to be a bit higher, but that's fairly low. And then also you see this kind of catch-all line there at the bottom. So everything you've been seeing on these 3 slides, it's all civil offenses. There's this catch-all for military offenses, and that's the big number. That's, as you can see here, it's 9,003. So to give you some examples of military offenses that would still, land a soldier or an airman in a prison or a DTC or rehabilitation center would be for violating the Articles of War. And so some examples would be desertion, AWOL, disobeying a superior officer, mutiny or sedition, misbehavior before the enemy. Misbehavior or sentinel would be a big one, like falling asleep while you're on guard duty, and then conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman would be some examples of military types of offenses. So that was all there on that one, Paul. And then again, the ever elusive naval services information. So this is what I was able to sort of scare up for, again, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, Navy, and what this just reflects is a 6-month time period. So these are prisoners convicted, entering into the prison system run by the Navy, and we've already gone through lots of those different confinement facilities, right? And again, we see the numbers, and I think, again, probably no surprise if you were to take, the end strength of the naval services and then the Army Air Forces, you'd see that oftentimes, you're seeing maybe about half, right, in terms of convictions here. Related to what we might see with the Army and the Army Air Forces. So again, I won't insult anybody's intelligence by reading down the list here of civil offenses. And yet again, you can see we've got a huge number, right? 13.5K, which are, again, those naval offenses, the same kinds of things I covered previously, violations of the Article of War.
And I wonder, Mark, whether there'd be any data about whether or not the number of crimes of all types decrease and increase in line with how the war is going, in that whether a sense of patriotism and war effort comes into play. And we're looking at 1945 now, and okay, by this period, the war in the ETO is over. The war in the Pacific is beginning to, the end is definitely in sight now, whether people kind of think, okay, well, we're going to win now. I'm going to go and knock off that shed of supplies and sell them on the thing. Whereas perhaps in 42, in the months after Pearl Harbor, even criminals are feeling, hang on, whether they're in the army or not, this is a time to kind of pull together. We're in danger of losing our freedom. I wonder whether there's any data on that, on how the progress of the war is affecting crime generally.
Yeah, so the most reliable and the most robust data set that again I've got access to would be the ETO and the JAG branch office. I think they fall under SHAEF initially, until of course SHAEF is disestablished, and then it's U.S. forces in the European theater. But oh my gosh, their records are just fantastic. I mean, they will give you a month by month laydown from 42 to 45 by offense, whether it's an enlisted man, an officer, whatever. And those are fascinating. And I actually did include one chart in here, and I know kind of with where we are on the clock right now, maybe we'll just kind of end with the statistics. I'm not sure we'll make it into examples, but we will, I think, have time to look at one of those types of charts, and it's just fascinating. You can look at this, and the one that we'll see here momentarily, it's for murder, but you can see just how much it changes, right? What the murder cases look like. 42, 43, then you see how the numbers change once the invasion takes place. Then what happens with the Battle of the Bulge, then you see the numbers just, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but they really kind of go up significantly, once Germany sort of proper has been invaded, once we've crossed the Rhine River in late March of 45, where the numbers go. So we do, I think, have it there, and you could actually take that for the ETO, because it's just the data set's fantastic. You could go back there because the numbers, I think the numbers do go into, as I recall, February of 46. And so you could take a look at that and see, okay, well, so as we look into whatever, summer of 45 or the fall of 45, how do those numbers change? And I can tell you off the top of my head, they do change significantly when it comes to say murder or rape. I think that even if you're a psychopath, I think maybe you recognize that your chances of getting away with those types of capital offenses are much more reduced as things sort of, begin to stabilize and occupation forces are in place, and we've got military and government in place, where it's a little bit more of a free for all, right? And that's why I think we see those, for instance, like those rape numbers are just so high in March, April, May of 45. It's just, I think that let's be honest. It's men pretty much, right? They figure like, hey, I want to do this and spoils of war, and if I'm ever going to get away with it, now's the time. So, I'm, again, very, very long answer to your question, but we could definitely do that now very easily with the ETO all the way to February of 46.
And we would have to kind of just separate the type of crimes of passion compared to the kind of crimes of profiteering, in that people who are trying to make money on the black market, they're using kind of intelligence and planning and foresight, whereas kind of assaults and murders and rapes although they can be premeditated and planned, they're more kind of spur of the moment kind of stuff. So I would guess that those kind of embezzlement, fraud, larceny kind of things would lessen off in times of the country being at peril. But yeah, we could go down that on another show. It's fascinating stuff. I don't know what it tells us, but it's telling us something. But we're on to the juicy bits of murder now. Everyone's waiting. Come on, Mark, talk about the murders.
Oh my goodness, yeah. What just the only thing that I would say briefly to respond to what you just said is that you certainly will find, and this is somewhat anecdotal. I'd have to go back and really do kind of like the quantitative forensic analysis on this, but. Yeah, there are lots of examples of soldiers who will go AWOL or who will desert, who may have already been predisposed to that type of behavior anyway, but they will, and it's so much easier in the ETO and then of course in the Mediterranean theater of operations to do this because it's just Western Europe and Southern Europe, and so it's much easier for these soldiers to just kind of disappear into the fabric. Things are kind of very chaotic anyway, restoring order and all this. And so oftentimes, they'll disappear into, say, Rome, or they'll go to Paris. So those are the two that kind of come to mind off the top of my head. But they will end up affiliating either with existing, like host national, isn't the right word to use, but like the French civilian populace. So French gangs that are already there involved in black market activity. Some of these, folks who've gone AWOL and who have deserted will link up with these groups. And of course, as a result of doing that, now they've got, again, the term that pops into my head, not the right term, would be like safe houses. And so they've got, sort of local civilian criminals who speak the language. They know where you can be hidden. They can protect you, and sort of in return, can you like siphon off some gas for us, or can you get us some parachute silk, or can you, or weapons, whatever it might happen to be. So that certainly does happen, and again, it's pretty obvious, but yeah, in population centers like, again, the size of Paris or Rome, it's going to be fairly easy to do, to sort of melt into the woodwork. Okay, so now, the juicy bit. So we get into some pretty good data here with looking at the ETO specifically. Again, this is really the most, robust is the word I keep going back to, but most in-depth information that's available. So I have a couple of charts that are dedicated to this. And we start off, unfortunately, with murder. And again, I haven't included them in here, but just fantastic charts that they lay out, where you can go, like I said, by month, by year, and see how all this tracks by offense, by unit, by rank. It's just unbelievable, but in a good way. But what I would just the highlights here would be that there will be in the ETO, and this is between July of 42 and October of 45, there'll be 206 U.S. military personnel found guilty of murder. 128 of a lesser offense, so it's basically voluntary and voluntary manslaughter, and kind of a fairly high number. I was a little bit surprised by that. The not guilty number, kind of a high number, but again, I'm not second guessing, those people at the time they made the call, but again, relatively high. And also kind of interesting that it's a kind of small number in terms of death sentences. So it's not a foregone conclusion, that if you murder somebody, that it's automatically going to result in a death sentence. As you see there, the vast majority are going to result actually in a life sentence, right, versus a death sentence.
And that's interesting. So I saw that data there, Mark, because in the war era, everybody is dealing with death as a far more day-to-day occurrence than they are in peacetime. So you would think that everybody, from courts to public opinion to those within the military, would be more. I would have assumed the rate of convictions and death sentences would be very high during the war, because of it being, let's say, just a something that everybody's much more used to than today. The fact it's that low, that's really surprising. Have you got kind of any hunch about why that would be?
No, not currently, but it would be, because a lot of this is available. And, I mean, not every general court-martial case, particularly if the individual, the defendant, basically, I'm using a civil term there, but if they were acquitted. But you could go back and look at a lot of those GCM cases, and because I mean, some of those records, I mean, they'll go on for one particular case 30 pages long, 50 pages long, and it includes testimony, and it includes the review by the reviewing authority. So yeah, I think it could be done. I'm with you though. I think it's very surprising, because you would think that if you're going to take take an individual or a group of individuals to trial, just as with any sort of judicial process. I mean, you want that evidence, you want witnesses. I mean, you really want it to be a slam dunk. So I'm with you. I think it's I probably need to make a note to myself here to go back and maybe see if I can try to tease out why the number is as high as it is there. Although I would say what we could probably attribute some of that to, I think, and it's actually on the very next chart here, where we talk about court-martials that are associated with killing German prisoners of war, that I think that's going to be a fairly significant chunk of that, because again, here we're talking murder, manslaughter, and I've got something to share here momentarily, a little bit more detail on this, but it's the way that we handle, for better or worse, the murder of German POWs is quite interesting. So it would not surprise me that of the 39 accused, that the vast majority, even though initially the specification in the case is murder or manslaughter, that ultimately it results in in an acquittal or some sort of trifling lesser offense. So yeah, and I think it's probably just as good a time as any to move to the slide now. The only thing we saw on the previous chart was to give you actually the number of accused, and it's broken into those three categories: U.S. victims, Allied victims, and enemy victims. So those aren't actually the number of victims; those are the actual number of U.S. military personnel who are accused of murdering, for an example. So the number of U.S. victims, as you might imagine, is probably going to be somewhat higher. It's not one person accused killed one individual. In some cases, it may be 2 or 3 or 4, whatever the number is. So that will be high, but those are the actual number of accused there. On the next chart there, Paul, and you may actually want to zoom in on this one for anybody who's interested. The topmost chart, is really interesting because it actually does give you this detailed breakout, not only by nationality, but are they civilians? Are they in uniform? They give you the gender, every single, for the most part, victim. I mean, it's just amazing the level of detail that it gets in here. It gets into, and they also give you the number of accused, and they break it out by race. Now, of course, what I think is kind of interesting there is it does beg the question. Okay, well, if you're only sort of I'm not going to use the word that I want to use, so I'll avoid that. But if you're separating into white versus color, okay, well then what about again Asian Americans? Where do Native Americans fit into it? Are we just lumping all of them into kind of like this white category? But yeah, it's a pretty interesting chart, kind of interesting takeaway that it's not just say what we would expect: Americans, German, and French. There are a number of English there, Belgians, Dutch, Polish. Kind of the list. Unfortunately, in this case, Hungarians. The list just kind of goes on and on and on there. So yeah, just maybe worth taking a look at that for a moment. One thing that I had skipped over, and I'll just give these figures, also kind of interesting, with regard to the number of accused overall. So the number of individuals who will be accused of a general court-martial offense in the ETO. The numbers actually are, again, I think refreshingly a little bit low. So from July of 42 to 31 October 45, about 1,600 officers are going to be accused of committing some offense, through a GCM. About 19,000 enlisted, 45 general prisoners. So these are individuals who have already been convicted and they're already in confinement, and they just can't help themselves. So they've done something else really bad. So they're going in front of another GCM. Also, as we kind of work our way down the list, some of these categories maybe are not so obvious. So there are 15 civilian employees, of the Army Air Forces that are also accused of general court-martial types of offenses. There are 8 merchant seamen. There are 2 American Red Cross employees, which I didn't know till I dug into this, but actually in wartime, they too can fall underneath the jurisdiction of the military commander. And then the last little group here, and this is one that I think, hopefully I can find the records for this. It's 7 Italian prisoners of war. So I don't know what they did, but 7 Italian POWs were accused of committing some, series of general court-martial types of offenses. Hopefully I can go back and, like I said, dig into that one in a little bit more detail. So let me get back here to the chart that you're on here, Paul, and good. Fast forward here a bit. Yeah, okay, so we looked at the top chart a little bit. Hopefully everybody's gotten a chance to look at how that sort of breaks out, by nationality, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, thanks, Paul, for doing that. That's an example of one of those charts that I was talking about earlier, and there are dozens and dozens of those, and they're just really, really interesting to look at. So as we look at this, and this is specifically just for murder cases. So we can see from July of 42 really until May of 44. I mean, look how low the number is, which again, the lower the better. That's a good thing. There's a little bit of a spike there in March of 44, but by and large, I mean, these are single digit, thankfully, instances of, general court-martial level murder offenses that hopefully resulted in convictions. And then again, and I don't think it's probably a surprise to anybody, but we can see how it begins to go up, once the invasion has taken place.
Yeah.
So June there, we see that it picks up, right? Peaks in August. Then it begins to plateau somewhat in the fall of 44, spikes again during the Battle of the Bulge, then drops off a fair amount there. And then, as I had alluded to before, it really jumps, pretty dramatically upon sort of the invasion of Germany proper, after, again, really the crossing of the Rhine. And so those murder cases are going to include, the murder of civilians and to a lesser extent, the murder of German prisoners of war. And I think, Paul, as you talked about earlier, like what happens, once peace sets in, we can see it's like a cliff, right? So we get to, what is it? I think May of 45, and it just drops off, precipitously, almost back to zero, by October of 45. So, and that's a good thing.
But we must stress this is for convictions. This is for someone asked on the chat earlier about what post-war was the process for going back and finding criminals murdering a war and going back and investigating. I guess the drop-off is dramatic, isn't it? Because there's things have become, there are different priorities and different needs, and so the as you said earlier about this idea of bringing back people to the units because there's a need to keep the war going, and you don't want to lose personnel. At the end of the war, the interest must just disappear very, very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think a really good example of that is that in July of 1945, Eisenhower basically does a call out to all of his major subordinate commands. I think there's 75 altogether that Eisenhower sends this directive to. But as you might imagine, we're getting closer and closer, creeping closer and closer to the beginning of the International Military Tribunal or tribunals in Nuremberg. And so, we want to make sure our own house is in order first. So it's fascinating. So Eisenhower puts out this directive. Hey, I want all of my division commanders, corps commanders, et cetera, go back, and I want to know, are there any instances that we've missed, again, of the murder of, say, German civilians, French civilians? I mean, it's not necessarily unique to any particular nationality, but what have we not sort of caught in the dragnet previously that we need to make sure that we still address, that again goes through the whole process and conviction if appropriate. And it's kind of like crickets, really. So so what comes back is it, and what the information I have here really pertains primarily to the killing of German prisoners of war. Only 3 divisions, right, out of all the divisions that are on the continent at this point. So basically, autumn of 45, only 3 come back and say, "Hey, boss, we think that we've done our internal division level investigations, and we do think we have some evidence, of war crimes that we had not caught, perhaps sort of just during the chaos, the day-to-day turbulence of combat." And that was, I think, 5th Armored Division, 99th Infantry Division, and the 101st. But also, when it comes to the Chenot massacre, which I don't think we'll get into the specifics today with the actual example, but that's another case where, and I'm not really sure to this day why Patton records the Chenot massacre in his diary. I guess we'll never really know, but it's documented, and I think that's probably one of the only reasons we even know that it happened, because he actually writes it down and talks about the estimated number of Germans that were killed in all this. But the perpetrators are members of primarily it's Baker Company, 21st Armored Infantry Battalion, 11th Armored Division. And so same thing. So Patton knows about this. He's trying to keep a lid on it, right, for a whole variety of reasons. But at some point, Eisenhower finds out about it. And so when Eisenhower comes back and says, "Hey, we really need to investigate this and get to the bottom of this. We're going into these war crimes trials. We don't need this thrown back in our faces." And the response the 11th Armored Division gives is, "Hey, boss, sorry, it's too late. They've rotated back to the States. People, they were wounded, they were killed. We can't get to the bottom of this now." So, yeah, like you said, sort of we sort of lose the wind in our sails there. So,
and we're in danger of going back to the point you made right at the beginning about the what about ism that we talked about. That at this point now, when you're dealing with the crime against humanity on such a monumental scale, that it does seem patently ridiculous to go back and try and find about. I don't mean that morally, but on this point to go back about the odd person here. And the other thing about, I'm now thinking about what you said about the reduced conviction rate for murders of German POWs, because pretty much every veteran I've ever met ever knows a story about various prisoners being taken who did not make it from the moment of capture to the safety of a prisoner of war camp. So everybody would have that story of, where do you draw, what we can't punish this guy here, because we all know a story, we all know something. Comes back to the basic principle of the victors writing the history, because there's so many potential areas for open for discussion about this, about that bring up, as we said, this idea, the bigger picture of morality, and what, if you're the winning nation, can you get away with things that the defeated nation can't get away with? It. There's so many, as we said, it's raising more questions than it is answering in some ways, but this data is fantastic. It's really fantastic. So let's move on to with rape a little bit, I think, because
in what you said, though, but what it brings to mind, I mean, and it's sort of, it can put commanders on a slippery slope. So, and again, I don't think we're going to get there, today. And I appreciate your time and everybody else's time, and hope everybody's enjoying this and getting something out of it. But maybe it's for a different time. But I make an argument that maybe it's not persuasive, but I make an argument that I think that probably at division level within the 101st Airborne Division, that somebody wearing a significant amount of rank puts the word out verbally that no prisoners are going to be taken. And it seems to be interpreted all sorts of ways. It's like, okay, take no prisoners until the beaches are cleared, take no prisoners for the first couple of days, the first week, and there are all these different interpretations. But given the fact that I have now seen, and Paul, you've, I think, interacted with many more veterans of the 101st than I ever will, but given now that I've seen these stories that you're talking about coming from veterans from all three of the parachute infantry regiments, 501st, 502nd, and 506, I think it lends more credence to the fact that maybe there was truly a verbal order given out. But it puts you on this path where, like you said, I mean, so if a division commander or division chief of staff, whatever, says this, then, so if someone, I mean, rather than the onesie twosie, that you German that you kill, or it's debatable, it's kind of a heat of the moment kind of thing. Well, what if some trooper goes out there and really commits a really heinous offense, like the Biscari, massacre, or the Chenot massacre? Well, you're on a slippery slope now, because if you try to prosecute that person, oh well, boss, like my company commander and then my battalion commander and regimental, they all told me not to take prisoners. So, and in fact, this does come back. Well, I wouldn't say that it bites Patton. He seems to have 9 lives and seems to be Teflon coated, but it does. And we're not going to get there today, I think. But when you look at the Tambach case, which is 8 April 45, 87th Infantry Division, again, maybe more for some other point, but with the Tambach massacre, and then also with the Biscari massacre, both with Captain Compton and Sergeant West, all three of those individuals use a Patton speech, Patton, a Patton speech as the rationale for why they did what they did. Oh, well, Patton came down here and said, like, no quarter, no mercy, kill, kill, kill. And so I interpreted that as, I'm not supposed to take prisoners, and so I'm going to go kill a bunch of Italian POWs, or I'm going to go over here and kill a bunch of, Germans in this town of Tambach. So yeah, that's why
Sheldrake made a very good point a minute ago. I put up on the screen again. His point of capture is the most dangerous place to be. You are choosing to give the enemy soldier your life. He has to choose to give it back. Some didn't, and with regards to that whole 101st Airborne verbal order of don't take prisoners. The version I've been told by a couple of officers within the 101st Airborne is they instructed their platoons in a kind of a ambiguously precisely ambiguous.
Yes.
The way they were told is if your job today is to get to objectives and acquire certain areas, knock out certain garrisons, take out certain crossroads, and if your administering of German prisoners you have taken is any way hindering your ability to get your objective completed, your priority is your objective. That's how I was told they were told, which you can read into that. If you holding a prisoner is preventing you getting to your objective, dispatch the prisoner to get to your objective. But that it wasn't ever said in that way. They were given enough implicit but yet hidden instruction to deal with it in their own way. And we do know there are cases of it being taken out a little bit more overzealously than perhaps was intended. But of course, as some people have always said, we've got Canadians watching this. This is nothing to do with the comparison of things like the Abbey Dardenne massacres and those other ones of after combat people being hands tied behind their back, shot in the back of the head, which is very different. And we're going down a real potential rabbit hole with this. By the way, Mark, I have actually, because of cancellation, got a slot open next Wednesday in the middle of Aviation the Pacific week, so we can actually continue this. If you happen to be free next Wednesday,
absolutely,
we can continue this discussion there, because we're not going to get it all
through
tonight. But
if you're willing to have me, I'm happy to come back anytime.
Happy to fit it, because I feel we haven't concluded. We're not going to get concluded on this today. So let's kind of get to a point where we can wind things up. But we've got the chart up now about the rape. So what can we learn by looking at that?
Yeah. So again, I think a few things jump out here, and it leads us to the same questions that I think you've already posed with regard to murder. So again, same time frame. So July 42, October 45 is what's reflected here in these numbers. And it is surprising. We see here that 551 military personnel, so they're going to be found guilty of rape. 67 of a lesser offense, but then really striking. I mean, the number of not guilty. 376. Almost as many as those that are found guilty. So again, just very, very, very sort of surprising number. And then we see the tie back into what we have covered earlier with death sentences. So out of those convicted rapists, 45 of them will receive the death sentence. And as you might imagine, and I would suspect, without having gone back and I could look at the numbers later, but that's going to be murder in conjunction with rape. It's not sort of just rape in and of itself. And then vast majority, life sentence there. Now, I think what's next is really, again, interesting, and I mean no disrespect to anybody out there, particularly any women. Yes, I know, again, this is it's a sensitive topic, and I'm not sort of like wanting to make light of this or trivialize any of this at all, but it is fascinating. I don't know, maybe hopefully in a good way or in a sort of intellectually beneficial way. But look at the numbers just for the three countries that are given here. So, and I think this tracks what we saw too with the murder, at least those who are accused of murder, between 42 and 45. Relatively small number. Of course, I think all of us would like to see that as a 0 for England, but we can see that, that's 121 rape convictions from July 42 to October 45, a very relatively long period of time. Okay, so that's not great, but it's a relatively low number. And then we can see it's going to pick up, right, as U.S. forces enter France. Okay, so now you're dealing with a much shorter period of time. Now it's June 44 to October 45. So now our numbers are beginning to go up. And then, of course, bullseye. You can see what happens in Germany again. It's just, and again, not to be hyperbolic about this, but that's 552, guilty convictions for rape, and it's really, by and large, in the space of about 2 to 3 months. Again, there are going to be some kind of at the leading edge, maybe like January, February 45. A few as you go into the occupation, but most of those are going to be March, April, May of 45. So pretty big number. And actually on this too, there is a person who I know is, and I'm forgetting her name now. I think it's a German historian who's written about this. Hers is more about sort of the rapes within Germany proper. She's gone back and looked at city government records and whatnot. But I think, and again, maybe I'm using another data set a bit inappropriately here. But I went back and looked at the Department of Justice statistics, which are, just really, really troubling. But some of their recent analysis would indicate that up to 80% of rapes and sexual assaults go unreported. And it's similar to surveys that were done a couple of years preceding. where reporting for rapes and sexual assault is in the low 30%. So I think, and I'm not doing this, I'm not trying to like stick a sort of a finger in the eye of, you know, the vast majority of our personnel, whether it's Allied or U.S., the vast majority were serving honorably, but not everybody. And so when I say that, I think in reality those numbers would be in the thousands. I think again it's probably a fairly low reporting rate because again, think about it. You know, you're a German girl, maybe you're underage, overage. You know, there's the whole issue of sort of family ostracism. There are a bunch of guys running around now with guns. Do I really want to report that I've been raped by one? Can I even prove it? Do I even have the evidence to prove, sort of, you know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, or even establish probable cause that I have been raped? So I think in reality, the numbers, if, you know, again, I know that I'm maybe using some relatively recent analysis a little bit inappropriately, but I think the numbers overall would be much higher than if
even that data we have there, the figure for France is 4 times higher from England for a period about an eighth of the time length of frame as well, or something like that. If my math isn't or worse. So that is dramatic. And as you say there, I would imagine, given the way that the American military are presenting themselves in the UK and in England and the Pathé newsreels and the way it's been set up, I would imagine the reporting of rape is fairly high in England at that point compared to Germany in 1945. And I think that would vary even within Germany, depending on where you're near. With if you're a victim of rape and you happen to be living within a 20-mile perimeter, let's say, of a death camp or concentration camp, and the world is focusing on the crimes of all that against humanity, that your personal suffering against an American soldier you'd go, oh, I'm not gonna go down to some office and report that when my whole city is being accused essentially of a crime against humanity. So
absolutely.
there's a lot that set of data is telling us, and there's a lot that's missing from that set of data as well. I think that is really fascinating.
Absolutely. And I wonder too, are you less likely to report a rape if you're in a small town versus a big city like, you know, a Cologne or an Aachen or Frankfurt or something? So that probably also comes into play as well, where again, I mean, you could be like ostracized by your entire small community of 500 people if you report this versus just shutting up and just kind of getting on. But I really like your point. That's fascinating. Where the closer maybe you're in proximity to the Holocaust in a very sort of visceral and just horrible way, maybe you're less likely to say.
Of course, I was thinking of that from the frame of mind of the victim during the reporting. Another fact I didn't consider, but it's worth considering, is the peer pressure within your own platoon kind of thing. If you're a part of a U.S. Army unit in England and you've been there and you're going and you know that collectively you're going and having dinner with families and there's relationships going on and you get invited to the country house to meet, and you know that one member of your platoon has raped someone, I would imagine your responsibility as a soldier who knows that happened, you're much more likely to report that in England than you are in Germany, where there's a collective, well, who gives a shit? They're just the Nazis kind of attitude going on. And that's not me saying that, folks. I'm thinking the kind of prevailing attitude of the US Army as they enter Germany in 45 is that, you know, we don't really care. We don't really care about so I don't care if my friend has gone off on some drunken spree and raped someone. I would have cared back in England. I would have cared in France, maybe. Although the France figure is also relatively high considering the length of time. So, of course, there are allies, but that's interesting. That France is, I have to give that some thought as well. But there's some really interesting information here. And another thing that I was told normally, we're going down another rabbit hole. I was told by a person up behind Utah Beach, is that when the American military set up these kind of civil departments, offices, and things like that, and they were deliberately, when they were setting up, often in the same building where the Germans had some kind of facility during the war. So the commandantur, in some cases, became the kind of civil affairs office post-war. Is that American military personnel, for example, were told don't wear your military, your headgear around, or don't salute each other all the time, call each other by your first name, because they wanted, when the French to go into these places, to not be giving off this overly military officious kind of atmosphere, because that's exactly how the Germans have been doing it. Because often it's the same place. Some of the French staff are still there. There are still the assistant, the mayor is still the same person behind the same desk that was there during the German occupation. But now you're going in there in the liberated country. So lots of captains calling sergeants Bill and Fred and John, and because they were trying to set up this thing there. And that's interesting as well. Even that aspect of how they're trying to create an environment where you can go and report crimes, whereas the Germans had previously an environment where you don't report things. There's so many areas we can go with this, Mark, and we will bring things to an end. And I think if you're happy to agree now, we'll carry on with this conversation next Wednesday, because now we're talking. I've got more things coming up into my head to expand on. But do you think we've got an obvious point where we can break it, Mark? Should we do a couple more? Is there more in this kind of general
I think, yeah, there are maybe one or two more, ETO slides.
Okay, we'll do that then.
Kind of scrolling through. It's entirely, well, obviously it's your call. But as you were talking, something else that popped into my head, and I'll just have to make some notes, about this for some later point. But one thing that I've speculated about that may be feeding into this is that, number one, the approach that the commanders take in the European theater, and really to the Mediterranean theater to a large extent, is that brothels are off limits, right? And so as a result, the VD rates, the venereal disease rates, they go through the roof because, and I'm trying to think of a tactful way to put this, but the kind of maybe woman you're going to end up with, right? I mean, versus one who might be in sort of like an established brothel where there's periodic sort of credentialing, medical testing, that kind of thing. So I think maybe that might also feed into this as well. So the fact that you can't just sort of freely, openly just kind of go to the, if you can get to it, the kind of the brothel in town there and do what you're going to do. So maybe that also feeds into this. And then too, I think about, fraternization. So I'd have to go back and see exactly when it gets instituted. But it's fairly early. I mean, I know what, Aachen Falls in October 44. I think by then that the leadership has already put out a non-fraternization order with Germans. I mean, if it hasn't happened by then, it's shortly thereafter. I mean, it is late 44. And so, I mean, and you really see it play out, once the war is over, where, I mean, that is still in place. And just, these GIs are just like beside themselves. I mean, like these German girls are everywhere, and there's just sort of all this pent up, energy, and so I wonder if some of that sort of feeds into a propensity to then sort of go out and seek women.
I just wanted to, I am listening to what you're saying. I just wanted to make a point that Susan, you said there is that when we had, for example, Dr. Philip Blood coming on not that long ago and talking about the horrific deeds performed by the Luftwaffe personnel in Poland against Jews in World War II and the absolute crimes of humanity, is we can mostly look at that as events from the past. That these things aren't happening. I mean, people would argue and say there are genocide. Of course, there are still genocides happening in the world. There is still lots of things going on. But in terms of the rape environment, and this is a very heavy subject to be discussing on World War II TV, we are pretty much living in exactly the same environment now as we were then. The number of rape convictions is still painfully low. The women are still not being believed in the numbers when they go and report. The system is not in place to support people enough. The number of rapes being reported, especially within marriage, all that kind of stuff, is that we're talking about stuff from 80 years ago that we might as well be talking about today, because things are not changing in that. And that's not really a subject. We're not here to talk about social issues today in World War II TV. But I think as one of the women watching this today, I think you and I should address the fact, Mark, that we are, alas, dealing with a problem that is still exactly the same today in many ways as it was back then. Because although we're talking about World War II, we're talking about mostly men carrying out the same sort of crimes men have always been carrying out and are still carrying out. And I wish I wasn't having to say that, but that is, alas, the world we're living in. And
by and large, getting away with it. I mean, it's an editorial comment, but
so Heavy stuff, but yeah, we're into the before we move on, we're into committing
lighter topics of
sodomy,
sodomy,
right? And sodomy. Another huge subject that is worthy of its own topic in its own right, because we're talking about, again, a crime that is not necessarily a crime, but it's anyway. I'll let you explain a bit more about the data we've got there.
Okay. Yeah. So, and really, my intent here was just to hit some of the highlights. One thing that we had skipped over on the previous slide was to look at statutory rape. I think everybody knows what that means when we talk about statutory rape. So I'll just kind of leave that where it is. But again, I mean, it's a fairly significant number. In fact, I mean, you have more guilty convictions for statutory rape than you do for all the convictions for rape in France. It assumingly we would assume would be above the age of consent. I mean, so it's a pretty large number. And if I may, I may be really digressing here, but I was hoping at some point I could get this out there. And one thing that I've heard from, I wouldn't consider myself a historian, I'm just a researcher and a curious person, but something I've heard from professional historians, like people who deal with the Reconstruction period and like what was happening with the KKK during that time period, people who deal with genocide, slavery. I mean, that's their area of academic expertise. I mean, if I may, and please, I hope somebody will tell me if I'm not handling this topic appropriately and with sort of enough, sort of care that it frankly really deserves. But I would tell you, particularly over the last week or so, once I got the kind of the green light that we had a date locked in, and I was trying to go back and pin down some of these numbers, and I guess we can get into some more of the patterns I've identified later on. But my goodness, it is just, I mean, I think anybody who's got any degree of empathy or feelings, and it might, like, this isn't sort of like play violins and feel sorry for me. I mean, I'm kind of commiserating, I think, with anybody who looks at this kind of information. But to build some of these slides, I mean, I literally had to go through thousands of general court-martial records, and it's just, I mean, at a certain point, like how many times do I have to read about somebody shooting somebody, stabbing somebody? Obviously, I'm not going to get into the specifics of any rape case, but just, I mean, it's just, at a certain point, like, I just got to sort of set this to the side. I can only sort of deal with so much of this before you just got to put it down, and it's just terrific. So.
Yeah, that's very true, and it's we've had the discussions in Holocaust Week about with Alina, particularly notably about how people who are studying that full time, how you have to separate work and private life, and how dealing with it, and do you ever become kind of institutionalized? Do you ever get to the point where it is just data, or are you still dealing with the humanity of it all? And of course, the reality is that anyone who's studying the Holocaust, it is still very much a human thing. It is. They are still shocked by it. They are still upset by it. It's not like you can, after a certain number of accounts you've read of the gas chamber experience, you've reached some kind of limit where beyond that it no longer affects you, because that just isn't the case, is it? I mean, it's going to just keep on,
right,
having that same emotional effect on you, which is the same thing we're dealing here. But it is interesting that as we discussed at the beginning of the program, is that looking at crime within World War II gets lost in the greater death in World War II. But it's interesting to spot some trends and things. And I wonder whether criminologists have done enough work about this, because they've got such a large body of work to examine World War II, whether they've been taking enough notice of it, well, if they've been looking at the time before the war and the time after war. But it is interesting. But yeah, we'll carry on with this. Let's have a look about the sodomy and guilty and not guilty, and a little bit about what that would actually constitute.
Yeah. So the big takeaway there, and this is something that I can maybe reinforce with a little bit more depth when we get to sex crimes at some point, with maybe some examples sort of carefully sort of conveyed. But what's interesting about this in general is that when you see sodomy convictions in the ETO, at least from what I've read, all the readings that I've done within the JAG records for the theater, is that those convictions are purely for non-consensual sodomy. And so when we think about, and Paul, you made this point before, I think about the couple. I think, I forget which company they were in the 506, but it's a gay couple. I mean, they just not a big deal. So that was really the approach in the ETO. Was that if it was consensual, yes, if you get caught, it may result in what they called a blue discharge at the time,
Yep.
which is, and we can get into more about blue discharges some other time. But I mean, there are tens of thousands of people that are. I mean, it's basically it's like a scarlet letter. I mean, to get a blue discharge. But what the numbers you see there would be for non-consensual sodomy, and that could be, boy, this topic. That could be either for humans or for animals. And maybe I'll just kind of leave that there. All sorts of disturbing sort of, images come to mind. But yeah. So, but again, I mean, a fairly high number of not guilty outcomes as well there. On that the last portion, it may not be entirely clear what that means. Combat division, total GCN guilty. What that basically is a summation of all of the guilty convictions through the general court-martial process for all the combat divisions in the ETO from July 42 to October 45. And we're not going to get there today. I've got an example of one. Again, it's just really fascinating stuff for people who want to really get into this. But in the JAG records, they have actually broken out every single combat division in the ETO, and like from left to right. So here's the division. Here's the number of months that they've been in theater. Here are the number of accused and convicted for whatever misbehavior before the enemy. Here are the number of accused and convicted for AWOL. It's just incredible. So, but ultimately, all that adds up to what you see here. And so, again, I would say, and hopefully, putting a silver lining all this is it's relatively low when you think about just the replacement rates and just I mean, even if the tooth to tail is significant, and maybe it's hundreds of thousands of people that are actually, combat engineers, infantrymen, field artillery, tankers, whatever, that are, up there, on the front lines. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of individuals. And so this is really, thankfully, I think, a relatively small number, particularly when you think about, for instance, here we've got, so for infantry divisions, there are 5,169 guilty convictions through general court-martial, amongst those divisions. Well, we need to bear in mind that there are 46 infantry divisions, U.S. infantry divisions in the ETO at the end of the war. Armored divisions, there are 15 armored divisions at the end of the war. And if airborne, of course, we have four airborne divisions. So,
but that does mean the airborne total is higher, isn't it? Percentage-wise.
A little bit, yeah. And I don't think
an airborne division is smaller, isn't it?
It is. It is
than an infantry division. So, not dramatically so, but it is higher percentage-wise. We say 46 divisions, isn't it? You said infantry divisions.
46 for infantry. Yep.
And in fact, they're smaller, and an airborne division is not static in that you have PIRs that move from the 82nd to the 17th and so on and so forth. So you should base it by regiment. Probably really would be the better way, but that seems high. That's going to be a we could do the math on that. I might do the math on that before the next show because that would be interesting.
Yeah, if you zoom in about the lower maybe 30% of that primary source document there, it does actually break it out by percentages. So to your point, Paul, so we see a higher rate of desertion in the infantry divisions. Actually, the airborne units have the lowest desertion rate of any of the three basic types of divisions. Their AWOL numbers actually are the highest, 2.93. Their Article War 64 is like disobeying orders, that kind of thing. Airborne troops never do that, but that's a higher number. Yeah, so you get some sense, I think, even today from looking at that, how that sort of stacks up.
That's it, but that's interesting. My brain is working overtime now. Desertion very low in the airborne. That makes sense because they're going to be esprit de corps, all those kind of things there. But it's fascinating stuff. And it's a pity we haven't got the data there for the kind of the rear echelon troops, because I think that would be really fascinating.
And also on that note, and this goes back to what you were discussing about, I think, rape primarily, and maybe to a lesser extent murder. But I think it would also be it would be informative to go back and take all these general court-martial records we can get our hands on, and then do that comparison. and see, because I mean, I can tell you anecdotally again, I mean, I've seen plenty of examples of GCMs for rape where it's not some rear echelon guy. I mean, it is an infantryman, it's a tanker, it's a field artilleryman, whatever, but that's completely anecdotal. I mean, so it would be interesting to see how those numbers, how they vary between, again, what we would call the combat support, combat service support, where arguably maybe there's, well, I don't know. I have to think through that. Like, do they have more opportunity or less, opportunity? But the numbers would be interesting.
The correlation would be to do with the world they're living, the amount of violence within their world. I think would have a huge bearing on that. And if you're an infantryman, you're dealing with much more blood, death, theoretically, than if you are stacking boxes in an ordnance unit onto the back of a truck. So the opportunities are interesting, but I would think the environment you're part of, the death being a daily part of it, and dealing with, if you're in infantry or airborne or armored, the fact that your life expectancy, you might be you're not going to make it through the month anyway, because you're up against, so you might as well go and do what you want to do when you've got 20, what I'm going to get killed in combat. I'll go and rape someone. It's fascinating. There's I thought we just got to do this a bit of an easy show tonight. We'll rattle through this, but it is a really, really fascinating. And yeah, and someone's saying we were hoping to see more of the stories of crime. Yeah, we will get to that. We'll do that next time, Marcus. Yeah, it's our fault for going through this, but I think what we're doing is we're setting up all the information. We're looking at it all so we can then go and the whole point was, Mark, is that as Mark will say, is we were going to go on. I'll prove it to you folks that we were going to go on there. Exactly. We'll do that next time.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, there's way. Yeah, this is if we're doing a two-part film, this is the film where it's kind of, you've got all the. It's Phantom Menace and Star Wars. It's all the trade negotiations first. We're going to get to the lightsaber duels later on. Okay, that's what we're kind of doing.
Right, right.
But let's have a look at the primary sources. Then we'll call it a day on this for this first part.
Yeah, and we see the big takeaway on this one. I mean, it's the AWOL and it's the desertion. So when you actually see the numbers in black and white, and it's not, again, sort of fuzzy math. I mean, I don't know. Again, I think I'm straddling the fence here, but if you put yourself in Eisenhower's position, and he's grappling with whether or not he wants to send this message. I mean, and as I think many of the viewers know, I mean, this really picks up around the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the AWOLs and the desertions. I mean, it happened previously, but it had really gone up pretty significantly. So what do you do? So do you sort of pick the one individual that that you really want to sort of make that statement with, and it's Eddie Slavic in this case, but yeah, I mean, that's not insignificant. I mean, you've got and whatever that adds up to, I think it's like 8,500 or something like that are actual convictions. I mean, that's not people that have been accused that may very well have gotten away with it, right? And they were just gone for a few hours or a day, and the commander said, "Okay, well, we'll let the bygones be bygones, not a big deal," kind of thing. So I'm sure there were many of those examples versus kind of more of our, again, hardcore. Oh, well, we were in the front line and you disappeared for a month, or where were you, kind of thing. You went AWOL during this attack. So pretty, again, pretty sizable.
My takeaway looking at that is how low plundering and pillaging is. And that's, again, because my brain is telling is that everyone is plundering and pillaging on some kind of level. So we're not going to start punishing people for something that all of us are doing kind of collectively as we move through countries. We're taking wine, we're taking apples, we're taking fruit, we're helping ourselves to this, that, and the other. So although that they do seem a bit kind of 17th, 18th century kind of piratey kind of plundering and pillaging, sounds very kind of antiquated, doesn't it?
It does.
It's interesting language, and I think that even the language used in these documents would be worthy of study as well.
Yeah, because the last time that the Articles of War had been updated before the war was 1921-22. So you can probably expect a little bit more antiquated, language. Yeah. And again, like throwbacks. I mean, I don't mean any disrespect by saying this, but I mean, we've got this lineage back to to sort of the English way of going about handling military justice. So we probably find something like letters of marque and reprisal. Or is it marque and reprisal? I think basically piracy, right? That we refer to in the Constitution. So yeah, and that's the last thing. And I know you want to wrap this up, and people have lives and probably want to go eat dinner. But back to the plundering again. that number is so small that between maybe now and next Wednesday, I may go back and look at those 16 specifically to see what.
Yeah, what did you? If it's
actually,
only 16, what did you have to do?
Yeah,
What did you?
yeah.
What volume did you have to plunder or
Yeah.
pillage to
Yeah.
actually get prosecuted for it? If only 16 people, people coming back with entire, enemy fleets they've kind of pilfered and sent back home.
Yeah, it's the Kelly's heroes, image that comes to mind of the company commander sending back the sailboat,
Yeah,
abandoning his soldiers so he can send the sailboat back. But yeah, I mean, it can't be a bicycle, or I stole some table silver, or a painting. I mean, it's got to just be really egregious. But I'm going to go back and look at that because it's only 16 cases.
So let's wind it up. And I'm not going to make any apologies, folks, for the fact we didn't get quite into the depths of the subject. We will just do it in part 2. And if you're free next Wednesday, we'll schedule it right away, because I had a guest drop out, and so we'll do that, and we'll carry on, and we'll just basically pick it up where we're going. And it's. I know you'd prepared this, and I had read what you sent me, but actually I realized there's a lot of potential discussions with this, and it raised more questions than it answered, but there is information to pull out of this. I don't know quite what it tells us, but I think it's telling us something. So if you're happy to come back, we'll do that. So I'll just
definitely
remind people what we got coming up. So tomorrow, Sol David is joining us to talk about the Special Boat Squadron, his book Silent Warriors. Then there's more stuff coming up at you later in the week. As usual, folks, don't forget to check out what we're doing on social media. I know we spend a lot of time talking about some of these subjects. We're not doing these things in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We're giving it the level of the length of time I think these subjects deserve. They are complicated, multifaceted. We've had people coming on giving us some real wide-ranging ideas and research here, and to just dismiss them and go over them lightly would be the wrong thing to do. We're going into it in depth, and it's not going to be for everybody, but it's going to be for those people who are interested in getting to grips with these subjects. So thank you for your loyalty and enduring the length of shows we do sometimes here in World War II TV, because we are trying to go into the beyond just the surface detail, really examine these subjects. So that's it. So follow us what we're doing on social media. Consider becoming a patron, and spread the word of what we're doing. But right now, it just remains to say to me, thank you very much to Mark for joining us, and we'll bring you back next week to conclude this, and we'll discuss in the meantime how we're going to develop that. We've got the PowerPoint. We'll just carry on. We'll do more detail about the juicy murders next time, folks. We'll actually go into the specifics of it. There's the carrots there to bring you in, but it is a really fascinating subject. And the thing is, as we've said before, this hasn't been discussed before. We are, you're going into an area that really hasn't been delved into. We've kind of cursory looked at every unit. When you're reading a unit, there'll be the odd little mention of someone goes off on a courts martial. But there's never an examination of it, and we've done a bit of that tonight. So it'll be really good. So, folks, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. I will see you all tomorrow with Sol, and I will see you all with Mark sometime next week. So cheers, everybody. Thank you for watching. Bye.